Chapter 9. Psychoanalysis and the problem of masochism. Freud gave two successive accounts of sadomasochism, the first in relation to the duality of the sexual and the ego instincts, the second in relation to the duality of the life and the death instincts. Both accounts tend to treat sadomasochism as a particular entity within which transitions occur from one component to the other. We want to examine to what extent these two accounts are really different, to what extent they both imply a transformist attitude on the part of Freud, and finally to what extent the hypothesis of a duality of instincts limits in both cases the transformist argument. In the first account, masochism is seen as deriving from sadism by a process of reversal. Every instinct is thought to include aggressive components which are directed upon its object and necessary to the realization of its aim. Sadism would, in this view, have its origin in the aggressive component of the sexual instincts. In the course of its development, the aggressive sadistic component may become conditioned in such a way that it is turned around against the subject's own self. The factors determining this turning around are of two main types. Aggression against the father and mother may be turned around upon the self either under the effect of fear of loss of love or as the result of guilt feelings, linked with the formation of the superego. These two conditions of masochistic turning around are quite distinct, as B. Grunberger pointed out, the first having a pregenital and the second an Oedipal source. 33 But in either case the father image and the mother image have very unequal roles, for even though the transgression bears on the person of the mother, its essential object must still be the father. He is the one who possesses the penis, the one whom the child wishes to castrate or to kill. He is the one who punishes, and who must be placated by this process of turning around. Hence, in every case, the father image seems to have a pivotal role. It soon becomes apparent, for a variety of reasons, that masochism cannot simply be defined as a form of sadism turned around upon the self. The first reason is that the process of turning around is necessarily accompanied by a desexualization of libidinal aggression, that is the relinquishing of specifically sexual aims. Freud shows in particular that the formation of the superego or conscience, which marks the resolution of the Oedipus complex, implies the desexualization of the latter. In this sense it is possible to conceive of a reversal of sadism, with the superego acting sadistically upon the ego without the ego itself being masochistic. There is no masochism proper without a reactivation of the Oedipus complex, hence without a resexualization of the conscience. Masochism is characterized not by guilt feelings but by the desire to be punished, the purpose of masochism being to resolve guilt and the corresponding anxiety and make sexual gratification possible. Hence masochism should be defined less by the process of turning around itself than by the resexualization of the aggression turned upon the self in this process. The second reason is concerned with another and quite distinct aspect of masochistic sexualization, namely its specific erogenicity. We may well grant that punishment should resolve or satisfy feelings of guilt, but this only constitutes a preliminary pleasure of a moral nature that merely prepares for sexual pleasure or makes it possible. It does not explain how sexual pleasure actually occurs in association with the physical pain of punishment. The fact is that the process of sexualization could never culminate without a particular masochistic erogenicity. For this we require some material basis, some peculiar link which the masochist experiences between his pain and his sexual pleasure. Freud suggested the hypothesis of libidinal sympathetic co-excitation, according to which processes and excitations overstepping certain quantitative limits become erotically charged. Such a hypothesis recognizes the existence of an irreducible masochistic basis. This is why Freud, even in his first interpretation, is not content with saying that masochism is a reversed form of sadism. He also maintains that sadism is a projected form of masochism, since the sadist can only take pleasure in the pain he inflicts upon others to the extent that he has himself experienced masochistically the link between pleasure and pain. Freud nevertheless maintains the primacy of sadism, while distinguishing between 1. A purely aggressive sadism, 2. A turning around of sadism upon the self, 3. The masochistic experience, and 4. A hedonistic sadism. But even if one maintains that the intermediary masochistic experience presupposes a turning around of aggression upon the self, this turning around must be regarded as one of the conditions for discovering the masochistic experience of a link between pain and pleasure, and cannot be said to constitute this link, the very possibility of which must point to a specific masochistic basis. 34. There is yet a third reason. The process of turning around upon the self may be regarded as a reflexive stage, as in obsessional neurosis. I punish myself, but since masochism implies a passive stage, I am punished, I am beaten, we must infer the existence in masochism of a particular mechanism of projection through which an external agent is made to assume the role of the subject. This third reason is clearly connected with the first. Resexualization is inseparable from projection. Conversely, the reflexive stage is indicative of a sadistic superego which remains desexualized. It is in terms of this projection that psychoanalysis tries to account for the role played by the mother image. Since, according to the theory, the masochist's aim is to escape from the consequences of the transgression against the father, he proceeds to identify with the mother and offers himself to the father as a sexual object. However, since this would in turn renew the threat of castration which he is trying to avert, he chooses being beaten both as exorcism of being castrated and as a regressive substitute of being loved. At the same time, the mother takes on the role of the person who beats, as a result of repression of the homosexual choice. Alternatively, the subject shifts the blame on the mother. It is not I, it is she who wishes to castrate the father, either in order to identify with the bad mother under the cover of projection and thus take possession of the father's penis, perverse masochism, or else, on the contrary, to make any such identification impossible by maintaining the projection and substituting himself as the victim, moral masochism. It is not the father, it is I who am castrated. 35. For these various reasons we must reject as inadequate the formula sadism turned around upon the self as a definition of masochism. It needs to be supplemented by three other considerations. The sadism must be 1. Resexualized, 2. The resexualization must be grounded in a new erogenicity, and 3. The sadism must be projected. These three determinations correspond to the three aspects of masochism which Freud distinguishes even in his first interpretation: an erotogenic aspect, as a basis for sexual excitation, a passive aspect, accounting in a very complex manner both for the projection onto the woman and for the identification with her, and a moral aspect or sense of guilt, to which the process of resexualization is related. 36 But the question is whether we save the Freudian theory by supplementing it in this way, or whether on the contrary we severely affect its validity. Rake, who maintains throughout the idea that masochism is derived from sadism, nevertheless points out that masochism springs from the denial that meets the sadistic instinctual impulse and develops from the sadistic, aggressive, or defiant fantasy which replaces reality. It remains incomprehensible as long as one assumes its derivation directly from sadism by effacing about against the ego. Much as psychoanalysts and sexologists may oppose such an opinion, I maintain that the birthplace of masochism is fantasy. 37 In other words, the masochist has renounced his sadistic impulse, even turned around upon himself. What he does is to neutralize his sadism in fantasy, substituting his dream for action, hence the primary importance of fantasy. Given these conditions, the violence that the masochist inflicts or causes to be inflicted upon himself can no longer be called sadistic, since it is based on his particular type of suspension. The question, once more, is whether we can still affirm the principle of a derivation when the derivation has ceased to be direct and therefore disproves the hypothesis of a straightforward turning around. Freud maintains that no direct transformation can take place between impulses or instincts that are qualitatively distinct. Their qualitative difference precludes any transition from one to the other. This is certainly true of the sexual and the ego instincts. Undoubtedly sadism and masochism, like any other psychic formations, represent particular combinations of the two instincts, but any passage from one combination to the other as, for instance, from sadism to masochism, can only occur by a process of desexualization and resexualization. In masochism the locus or theater of this process is fantasy. Are we to say that the same subject participates in both sadistic and masochistic sexuality, given that the one implies the desexualization of the other? Is this desexualization an actual process experienced by the masochist, in which case a transition could be said to occur, however indirectly, or is it on the contrary a structural presupposition of masochism which severs it from all communication with sadism? When we are given two stories, it is always possible to bridge the gaps that separate them, but in the process we arrive at a third story of a different quality from the other two. The psychoanalytical theory of sadomasochism appears to be doing just this. For instance, the image of the father, in view of its importance in sadism, is regarded as still continuing to operate in masochism, disguised under the mother image and determining its role. This method has a serious drawback in that it displaces the emphasis and gives crucial importance to secondary factors. For example, the theme of the bad mother does indeed appear in masochism, but only as a marginal phenomenon, the central position being occupied by the good mother. It is the good mother who possesses the phallus, who beats and humiliates the subject or even prostitutes herself. If we ignore this and give prominence to the bad mother, it is all too easy to re-establish the link with the father, and the corresponding link between sadism and masochism. The existence of the good mother, on the other hand, implies the existence of a gap or blank which stands for the abolition of the father in the symbolic order. Again, while the sense of guilt has great importance in masochism, it acts only as a cover, as the humorous outcome of a guilt that has already been subverted, for it is no longer the guilt of the child toward the father, but that of the father himself, and of its likeness in the child. Here again we come across a blank which is hurriedly filled in by psychoanalysis for the purpose of deriving masochism from sadism. The fallacy is to treat as an ongoing process a state of affairs which must already obtain, which must already be presupposed for masochism to be possible. When guilt is experienced masochistically, it is already distorted, artificial and ostentatious. Similarly, the father is experienced as already abolished symbolically. In trying to fill in the gaps between masochism and sadism, we are liable to fall into all kinds of misapprehensions, both theoretical and practical or therapeutic. Hence our contention that masochism can be defined neither as erotogenic and sensuous, pleasure pain, nor as moral and sentimental, guilt punishment. Each of these definitions implies the possibility of any manner of transformation. Masochism is above all formal and dramatic. This means that its peculiar pleasure-pain complex is determined by a particular kind of formalism, and its experience of guilt by a specific story. In the field of pathology every disturbance is characterized by gaps, and it is only by grasping at the structures demarcated by these gaps and taking the greatest care not to fill them in that we may hope to avoid the illusions of transformism, and to make progress in our analysis of the disturbance. Doubts about the unity and intercommunication of sadism and masochism are further reinforced when we come to Freud's second interpretation. The qualitative duality is now that of the life and the death instincts, eros, and then agos. Let us immediately note, however, that the death instinct, which is a pure principle, can never be given as such. All that is given or can be given are combinations of the two instincts. Accordingly, the death instinct manifests itself in two different ways, depending on whether, under the action of eros, it is turned outward, sadism, or whether part of it remains as a residue libidinally bound within the organism, masochism. In the latter case we have masochism of the erotogenic type, which is primary and no longer derived from sadism. Nevertheless, we re-encounter the previous theory in terms of turned-around sadism which produces the other types of masochism, the passive and the moral, and we are faced once again, even more starkly, with our previous doubts. For it now appears that the passage from sadism to masochism implies not only the process of desexualization and resexualization but equally a diffusion of instincts as well as their combination. Both sadism and masochism imply that a particular quantity of libidinal energy be neutralized, desexualized, displaced, and put at the service of then agos. Thus we never have a direct transformation of one instinct into another, but a displacement of cathectic energy. This is what Freud means by diffusion. He isolated two fundamental occurrences of diffusion, narcissism, and the formation of the superego. The whole problem lies in the nature of these processes of diffusion and in how they are related to the combination of the instincts. Fusion. Everywhere we meet with a combination of the two instincts, but at the same time diffusion is at work everywhere.